Noah Prince between the rise of Marvel Comics in the 1960s and the magnificent Marvel age of the 1980s, there was a time undreamed of when Roy Thomas and John Buscema lent their talents to create a comic of one of the greatest and most influential pulp heroes of all time. Hither came Tarzan. And so, yes, the famous creative team, so well known for their massive body of work on Conan, did indeed do Tarzan for Marvel Comics back in the 70s for 14 glorious issues and one annual. And so we're obviously going to do a review of this run, and we're also going to talk about maybe a little bit of a connection Roy threw in there between Tarzan and Conan. And we're also going to talk about some of the plans that they had that didn't work out. It's going to break your heart, but let's get started. So if you're like me, when you think of 1970s Tarzan comics, you're probably thinking of DC Comics done by Joe Kubert, because in 1972, DC Comics started to put out Tarzan. In the final issue of the spin-off title Tarzan Family in December of 1976, they said that they were ending the series because of sales, but also because Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc. was wanting to put out stories of their own characters, presumably in comic book form. And so, naturally, in February of 1977, the final Tarzan comic from DC would be released. However, in June 1977, Marvel Comics put out their first issue of Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle. And according to the editorial in here, Burroughs Inc. approached them asking for Roy and John to do this book. So that's only 4 months between the last DC issue and the first Marvel one. Now, I'm going on the dates inside of the comics, which could be a couple months off, but regardless, there was a very quick turnaround between what they told DC and them starting at Marvel. So I don't know quite what happened, I just know that it happened. All right, so let's talk about the format of this comic, because it's a little bit different. So in the 1970s, it was a very difficult time for the comic industry, and there were only 17 pages of story in a normal Marvel comic. In Europe, the common length of a story was 15 pages. And so these were stories that were first published in America, but were also designed to be reprinted in Europe. And so to fill out those couple extra pages that Europe wouldn't get, they would sometimes do pinups and/or ape the English dictionary pages as well. And all of this was done by John Buscema. And in most issues, there would be one page of story that would only run in America. For instance, in issue 2 is this page that implies that Tarzan makes some jungle love to Jane before he leaves for Opar. Usually this extra page of story would be a splash page, but it would fit seamlessly into the story. But if you didn't read it, the story would still flow just fine, which is a pretty impressive feat. So let's talk about the artwork by John Buscema. And so Buscema is, of course, best known for his work on Conan, along with various other Marvel titles, but I know him from Conan. And I gotta say, his Tarzan does bear a little bit of resemblance to the Barbarian, but I'm okay with that. I mean, you know, if you want to argue that Tarzan and Conan are related, sounds good to me. And so I think John Buscema is a very good choice for Tarzan artist. He actually may be more ideal for Tarzan than Conan. And I say that because, in my opinion, the one thing he doesn't necessarily always excel at in both those books is costume design. So, for instance, look at Law of Opar here, right? I would have a hard time telling her apart from 1,000 other women that John has drawn over in Conan. But if I look at how other comic artists have drawn Law over the decades, she's much more distinctive, much more interesting looking, and much closer to how she's described as looking in the novels. However, there are very few fantasy elements in this run, and I think John absolutely excels at pretty much everything else, right? His Tarzan looks amazing, his animals look amazing, so does his regular people like Jane here, and just the sheer dynamic storytelling, the drama, the action that he is so good at rendering. He is absolutely an ideal Tarzan artist. And that includes his spectacular covers with dynamic action, amazing rendering. I mean, look how wonderful these panthers look. I mean, this is just really a spectacular shot, right? But the action is just as good on the inside, where the fight just flows from panel to panel, and between the story and the art gives us some of the best fight scenes ever done in a Tarzan comic. Now, John's artwork is going to vary a little bit between issues, especially when we get to the end and he stops inking himself and they go for a bunch of different inkers. You know, there's like a different inker every issue. But even when it's a little bit off or doesn't seem as detailed, it's still really good. But honestly, if sometimes his costume design is a little generic or his artwork seems sketchy, that's kind of understandable. Just to give you an example of the man's workload, the same month that Tarzan came out, his artwork also appeared in Savage Sword issue 19 and also Conan 75, which, by the way, is one of the earliest Conan storylines I fished out of a back issue bin and still one of my favorites. By the way, the first issue's cover pays tribute to the issue of All Story magazine that originally printed Tarzan of the Apes. And so that is, of course, a very, very appropriate thing to pay tribute to on your first issue of Tarzan. Speaking of comic legends who were workhorses who did way too many comics at one time, let's talk about our writer, Roy Thomas. Now, Roy has done every superhero under the sun, but he's also very, very well known for putting out Conan. However, his approach to Conan is very, very different than his approach to Tarzan. So Conan started as a series of short stories by Robert E. Howard, and those stories took place throughout Conan's life, and they were published in a non-linear fashion. So when the comic series started, Roy made this a chronological telling of Conan's life from when he left Samaria to presumably when he became king. And Roy kept to the short story format by having each issue either be self-contained or be part of a very short plot line. Now, the stories would build on top of each other and would tell, his journeys when read together, but he understood that Conan is best suited for shorter form storytelling. Tarzan, on the other hand, started as a series of serialized novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs. He was also known for having a long-running, very successful comic strip. Both of these types of storytelling were very long form, they were long, epic adventures. And so this is a comic series that does a serialized adaptation of the Edgar Rice Burroughs novel, Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar. And it moves at a very leisurely pace. How leisurely? When Gold Key did its adaptation of Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar back in the 60s, it was 3 issues long, which was almost unheard of. This was 72 pages long, a big, huge epic at the time. The Marvel Comics adaptation is 9 issues long. If we're only counting the 15 pages an issue that they got in Europe, that would be 135 pages, almost twice as long as Gold Key. And that's not even counting the extra pages we got in the States. So the amount of story covered in each issue is actually pretty close to modern pacing, but with a big difference that instead of using that extra space to just do big images or splash pages, this still does dense storytelling, and so it uses that extra space it has as it slows down to go into more detail, to give you more blow by blow of exactly what happens in the novel, and it's wonderful. And honestly, some of the parts I love the most about Burroughs' novels are just little details. Like, for instance, there's a bit of narration on a scene with Mugambi, which tells that he went to London with Tarzan and learned about Western culture there, which is just a really neat thing to know about his character. And it takes the time to do little scenes like Tarzan having to wait on the apes that get distracted on the way to the raiders' camp, reminding us that despite Burroughs's proclivities that he gave his apes, he still wrote them as animals. Roy also takes advantage of the space to orient the reader. For instance, he often explains to the reader that to regular humans, the language of the great ape sounds just like regular animal noises when it's spoken between simians or between Tarzan and a simian. It's shocking how many comics don't explain this. And they have this really great visual representation when they're speaking the language of the great apes with these rough, thick borders around the word balloons that really make it easy to visualize that, yeah, this is a language that's being spoken in snarls and growls. So, issue one of the series starts with an issue that's essentially an original creation for the series in which Tarzan saves Albert Werper from danger, essentially just showing the reader what a day at the office is like for Tarzan. Issue 2 begins the adaptation of Jewels of Opar, but does insert a very lengthy flashback to Tarzan's origin. It is a very abridged version of the origin, and they do change how he gets the loincloth for the first time. In the novel, he gets it from African natives. In this version, he's inspired by the books he reads to create clothing for himself. And then everything else is pretty much straight out of the novel with a few changes, a few things rearranged, and a few things left out, like in any adaptation. So in Jewels of Opar, Tarzan runs into some financial problems, and so he decides to go to the lost city of Opar and take some of their gold. While he's in Opar, there's an earthquake, and he's hit on the head and loses his memory. He forgets he's a human and reverts back to being an ape when he's young. And so the one change from the novel is that in the novel, he retained his ability to speak English. Here, he can only speak the language of the great apes with his memory loss, which kind of makes sense. He gets into conflict with the high priestess of Opar, Law. But the true villain of the novel is Albert Werper, who makes both hero and villain in this novel believe he is on their side, he manipulates them, and then tries to stab them in the back, sometimes quite literally. He is after the riches of Opar for himself. Werper is allied with the villainous Ahmed Zek, an Arab raider who launches an attack on Tarzan's African estate and kidnaps Jane. Jane, of course, escapes, as she tends to do, and has her own little adventure plotline, as well as Mugambi and the Waziri. This is pretty much everything that makes Tarzan great in one big epic storyline. And Roy even threw in a Conan reference in issue 3. And so in the scene, La is speaking in ancient Atlantean during a sacrifice. And she actually says the name of their sun god, which in this comic is Valka. And Valka is a god in the Thurian age of Kol the Conqueror, who is originally from Atlantis. It's just an inside reference for his fans. I wouldn't take it too seriously. Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc. actually wouldn't let them do any crossovers with other characters. So I guess their policy on Tarzan comics must have been the opposite of what it is now. And just like in any comics, mistakes were made. The Abyssinians were accidentally colored as white in their first appearance in issue 6. This was corrected in their subsequent appearances in the story. By the way, Abyssinians are actually from modern-day Ethiopia. It was actually the Empire of Ethiopia at the time, and they actually literally fought off colonization. Kind of cool. And so I think the 9-issue adaptation is a really awesome way to adapt a novel. But I also think that the Gold Key actually has strengths that the Marvel Comics doesn't, and is absolutely worth picking up as well. There's absolutely no substitute for Russ Manning's epic rendering of the attack on Tarzan's estate. But there's also something really cool about how the Marvel comic goes into the detail of showing Mugambi with Jane as the Arbiters approach, and then showing the epic battle that they have with the Mugambi and the Waziri, and Jane has a gun, and there's just so much cool stuff you can do when you go into more detail. So both versions of Jewels of Opar are absolutely worth getting, and the Marvel Comics version ends with issue 11. So wait a minute, didn't I say it was 9 parts? How do we have a 9-part story that lasts 11 issues? And so if you have Marvel Comics from the 70s, you probably know the answer: filler issues. But don't worry, all the fillers are done by the same creative team, and they are adapting Jungle Tales of Tarzan, which are stories set in Tarzan's youth back when he lived with the apes shortly before he met Jane. Jungle Tales begins in the first annual, which adapts Tarzan's first love and the end of Bakawai. Issue 7 is the first filler issue, and it adapts Tarzan Rescues the Moon. Issue 9 is the second filler, and it adapts The God of Tarzan. Issue 12 begins a series of fillers between plot lines since Jewels of Opar is over, and it adapts The Lion. Issue 13 adapts Jungle Joke, and I gotta say, this is probably my favorite cover of the run. It's just so unusual and is a great argument for giving each Jungle Tale their own cover. And Roy ends his run with issue 14, which is an adaptation of The Battle for Tika. And so they adapted 7 out of 12 of the chapters from Jungle Tales of Tarzan, and I suspect if Roy had kept going on the series, they may have adapted all of them eventually. But I gotta say, they are amazing. The fact that they're out of order doesn't diminish them at all. These are definitely issues worth picking up. And by the way, the issues that were published in the middle of Jewels of Opar do acknowledge that in the story. In issue 7, it actually opens with this beautifully drawn 2-page recap of where they were at in the main plot line. And the incredibly dense and thorough storytelling we got in Jewels of Opar is also present in Jungle Tales, and gives us a rare scene where we actually get to see Tarzan cutting his hair. So why did Roy leave Tarzan? Of course, because he was doing too many other comics. He was doing Conan and Savage Sword and Red Sonja and other titles, and something had to give, and so he decided to give up Tarzan. They also had some really epic plans for the second year of the magazine. In the letter column, they announced that the next novel that they would adapt would be Tarzan at the Earth's Core, and then a few issues later, they said that due to legal problems, that was not going to happen. And in the letter column, they also said that the second Tarzan annual was going to be a crossover between both of their Edgar Rice Burroughs titles. It was going to be a Tarzan annual that would cross over into the John Carter Warlord of Mars annual. And so you would have Tarzan and John Carter of Mars meeting for the first time in comics. And it was going to be done by the regular creative teams for both titles. So that would have been Roy and John on the Tarzan side, with Marv Wolfman and Gil Kane on the John Carter side. That would have been epic, but a few issues later, they indicated that was not going to happen, and they seemed to indicate that it was Deep Six by Edgar Rice Burroughs, Inc. And just to head off comments I keep getting on this run, yes, there are foreign language collections of this run. No, there is no English collection of this run. I've heard of no plans for an English collection. The solicitation for an omnibus of this run from Dynamite is a zombie listing that is not happening. I have no idea why that listing exists, since Dynamite has never done a Tarzan collection like that. If it did happen, it would come from Dark Horse, which has not published a new Tarzan collection since 2022. That's why I hunted down the individual issues of this run, and if you're interested in it, I recommend you do the same. I've got this series in my regular reading mix, so I'm reading about 1 issue a week. So in a few months, I'll review the last half of the Marvel Comics run. I'm looking forward to it. but I've got plenty of reviews to do in the meantime, so like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.